Class. Today we're going to be creating our very own monster. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about our standards that we have to learn. Georgia tells us that we have to learn these standards, and these are just something that we have to go by. So, the standard that we're going to be learning today is called the variation of traits. And all this standard is it tells us that offsprings, like me and you, or different organisms, are acquired mix of traits that they receive from their biological parents. So, who do you think you got your hair color from? What about your eye color? Okay. So these are traits that are determined by the Mendelian inheritance. What is the Mendelian inheritance? So the Mendelian inheritance was discovered by Gregory Mendel. And the first law that he created was called the principle of segregation. And the principle of segregation tells us that when an individual creates sex cells, one half of the sex cells carries alleles, and the other half of the sex cells carries the other alleles. Two alleles. So we'll have two, one half carries one, and the other half carries the other. An allele is just a version of a gene. And then those are determined, our traits that we receive are determined by our dominant trait and our recessive trait. A dominant trait is what the allele expresses, and then the recessive trait is not expressed, it's masked. So another question I have for you, who discovered the Mendelian inheritance? Yes, Gregor Mendel. So, genetics are traits that are often determined by alleles, and they could be dominant or they could be recessive. The majority of the time, you're going to have a dominant trait. Now, you will have a recessive if you only have two recessive traits. So if you have a dominant trait and a recessive trait, that recessive trait doesn't matter. We're only going to have a dominant trait. Now, if you have two recessive traits, then you will have that recessive trait. A dominant trait is expressed whenever at least one dominant allele is presented. Now, a recessive trait is only expressed whenever you do have those two copies of recessive alleles. For example, my eyes are brown, and both of my parents have brown eyes. So I received that dominant trait from them. Now, let's say that my mom's eyes were blue and my dad's eyes were brown, and my eyes were brown. I would have received my dominant trait from my dad and that recessive trait from my mom, meaning I didn't get blue eyes because the dominant trait overpowered the recessive trait and gave me brown eyes. One question I have is, if your mom's eyes is the color blue, and the alleles for blue is dominant, but your dad's eyes is the color brown, and the alleles for brown is recessive, what trait would you inherit? Very good. It's very similar to my story, but I wanted to give you a reference to what my life is versus what you could think in your head, because I know you're smart and I know you got this. Okay, I want you to raise your hand and tell me what you learned about the Mendelian inheritance. Yes. Right, yes. The dominant alleles is more powerful than that recessive alleles, and even if you have a dominant and a recessive, you're only going to have that dominant trait show, right? What if you have two recessive? That's right, the recessive trait is going to show. Y'all are so smart. You got this. Alright, now we're going to move on to creating our monster. So, in this activity, or this lab, we are going to create our own monster, and everybody is going to get a chart that has different genotypes and phenotypes, and those genotypes and phenotypes are going to tell us what our monster is going to look like, and what maybe like eye color or eye shape or head shape or what it's going to look like. And those are going to be determined by flipping a coin. So I have some papers for you here, and I'm going to show you, and I'm going to do a couple of them with you, so don't worry. But we have our table for the female, which would be the mom, and we have the table for the male, which would be the dad. And so what we're going to do is it tells us our alleles already. Okay, so it tells us our alleles already, and how we're going to determine our genotype and our phenotype is by flipping a coin. So I'm going to flip my coin, and I got tails. So we're going to mark alleles as heads, and alleles 2 as tails. See that? Okay, so since I got tails, it tells me that my eye shape is just going to be one large eye. So in our genotype, we're going to write a lowercase e for that recessive trait. Our dominant traits are capital, and our lowercase traits our recessive traits are lowercase. And then we're going to flip it one more time to determine if we're going to have a recessive, another recessive, or a dominant. And I got tails again, so that means that I'm going to have a recessive trait. So I'm going to write another lowercase e. And now I know for my phenotype that my monster is going to have one large eye. Okay, so we have one large eye. Alright, now I'm going to do the next one with you, and then I'm going to let you do some by yourself. So I flipped my coin again. I got heads this time. So my heads is my dominant, and it tells me that my eye color is going to be red, possibly red. So I put my capital R. And now we're going to flip again. And I got tails this time, and so now it tells me that I need to write a lowercase r for white. Now, what will happen since I have a dominant and a recessive? Right, we are going to have a dominant alleles, so that means that my eye color is going to be red. Very good, very good. Alright, so I'm going to let you finish filling these out on your own. And then when we come back, we'll do the male chart. Okay, now that I've given you a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and look at our male chart. So you see that it already gives us some phenotypes, and it actually already gives us some genotypes as well. So we're just going to fill in the blanks. Alright, so we know our eyes gives us 2 lowercase, and so that is what? Right, a recessive. And since we know that this is recessive, we can come back up here to this female chart where it tells us our alleles, look at our recessive, and we know that our dad monster had one large eye. And so we're going to write that in for our phenotype, one large eye. All right. Now, looking at the eye color, it already tells us that that phenotype is white. So what does that mean? If our white is a recessive trait, what does that mean that we have to have to make, or what does our genotype have to be to make that white? Right, we have to have 2 recessive Ailey. So we're going to write 2 lowercase r's. Alrighty, I'm going to let y'all finish filling out the rest of these while I walk around and help and ask if anybody needs help. Maybe call a few people over that need a little bit of extra help. Alright, now that we have our chart all figured out, we're going to move on to our Punnett squares. These are called Punnett squares, and what we're going to do is we're just going to plug in our genotypes, and then we're going to see what our baby will have. Okay, so I'm going to do the first 2 with you. We have our eye and our eye color. So we know that our female, our mom monster, had 2 recessive for the eye. So we had 2 lowercase e's, and you're just going to write it just like that. Okay? And then when we look down at our dad monster, we know that he also had 2 lowercase e's, 2 recessive alleles for his genotype. And so then, once I write that on the side, we're just going to plug them in. So we see that we have lowercase recessive, lowercase recessive. So in this first box, we're going to write lowercase and lowercase e. And then we're going to do the first one and this one for right here in this box. Both of those are lowercase recessive, so we're going to write lowercase recessive. And then we're going to move on to this one again and match it down here for this box. And we're going to do recessive again because we have recessive alleles. And then for this one as well, we're going to do recessive. So what is our baby monster going to have if all of these are recessive? That's right. It's going to have 1 large eye. 1 large eye. Very good. Alright, moving on to our eye color. For our female, our mom monster, we had a dominant and a recessive for the eye color. Okay, so we had a dominant and a recessive. I messed up right here, so I just marked it out. And then for our dad monster, our male, we had 2 recessive. So we had 1, 2. Okay, and now we're just going to plug them in. So we have a dominant right here, so we're going to pull our R down. And then we're going to come right here and look. So we have recessive, so we're just going to move that over. And that gives us a dominant and a recessive. Okay. And then we're going to come right here. We're going to pull this one down, our recessive. And then we're going to come back here again and move it on over. We have another recessive. So we have a recessive and a recessive. And then right here, we're going to pull this dominant down again. And pull that recessive over. And then moving on to here, we have 2 recessives. So we're going to plug those in there. Alright, so since we have a dominant and a recessive, what is our baby going to have? That is right. It's going to have that dominant trait. And so our eye color is going to be red. Alrighty. So now that I've done these 2 with you, I want you to go in and fill the rest of them out. And then when we get done, we're going to actually draw and color our own monster. Now that everybody's filled them in, pull out this paper that I gave you. And you have this box up here. This is where I want you to draw your monster based off of those Punnett squares that we just filled out. And so we know what eye color, we know what eye shape, we know what face shape, all the things. We're going to draw our monster and color it the colors that it tells us. And then once you get done, there's a few questions I want you to answer just to see what you learned. So our first question is, Who discovered the Mendelian inheritance? And then our next question that we're going to answer is, if you have a dominant and a recessive allele, will the trait be dominant or recessive? And then our last question is, where do we get traits from? How do we get those traits? So I just want you to answer those, and then we'll talk about it. Did y'all have so much fun learning about the Mendelian inheritance? Good. Now you can go home and tell your mom and your dad where you got your traits from, right? Isn't that so fun? And you can even show them your monster that you created.